The first thing 49-year-old widow Eleanor Hayes heard
You'll
through the
take the
blizzard
bed.
was a man shouting
I'll keep the
words
stove
no
fed.
respectable woman
Thank you,
expected
Mr.
from a
Mercer.
stranger. Share my bed or freeze. She stood inside the doorway of
You'll
a
take the
one-room
bed, ma'am.
Wyoming line cabin, snow melting from her
where will
silver-streaked
you
brown
sleep,
hair,
Mr. Mercer?
while the cowboy who had dragged her half-conscious from a buried wagon pointed toward the only bed in the room. Eleanor stared at him as though freezing might be preferable. I beg your pardon? The man was 46-year-old Jacob Mercer, a broad-shouldered cattleman with a weathered face, dark beard touched with gray, and the exhausted eyes of someone accustomed to speaking more often to horses than people. He threw another piece of cottonwood into the stove. Floor will be near freezing before midnight. Beds closest to the stove. 2 blankets. We share the warmth, or neither of us sleeps. Eleanor tightened the borrowed wool blanket around herself. And you expect me to believe this is hospitality? Jacob looked toward the window where snow moved sideways across the glass. No, ma'am. I expect you to believe the thermometer. By morning, one of them would risk everything to keep the other alive, and the people of Willow Creek, who considered Jacob Mercer incapable of loving anyone, would eventually learn what happened inside that lonely cabin. But neither Jacob nor Eleanor knew that yet. All they knew was that one of the worst winter storms to strike the territory had erased the trail behind them, and surviving until daylight suddenly required trusting a stranger. Hours earlier, Eleanor had been traveling east in a small hired wagon toward Willow Creek. She had spent 23 years married to a railroad clerk named Charles Hayes, buried him the previous spring, sold nearly everything they owned, and started west after receiving 3 letters from her daughter Rebecca. Rebecca's husband had broken his leg during autumn roundup, leaving their small ranch dangerously short-handed. Eleanor had answered simply, I am coming. She was not searching for adventure. At 49, she believed adventures belonged to people young enough to mistake uncertainty for excitement. She wanted usefulness. Widowhood had emptied her days faster than grief had emptied her heart. Then the weather changed. The morning had begun strangely warm. By afternoon, clouds covered the northern horizon. The wagon driver, Amos Pike, noticed antelope moving south and urged the horses faster. Temperature dropped so quickly that rain became sleet and sleet became snow before they reached shelter. One wheel struck a frozen rut and shattered. Amos took the stronger horse and rode toward Willow Creek for help, promising to return. Eleanor waited beneath the wagon canvas. 1 hour became 2. Snow buried the broken wheel. Darkness approached. She finally understood that staying with the wagon meant disappearing beneath it. Eleanor wrapped herself in 2 blankets and followed what remained of the trail. She made perhaps half a mile before losing every landmark. Wind knocked her down twice. The third time she remained there, that was where Jacob found her. He had been driving 3 missing cattle toward his winter pasture, when his bay gelding, Copper, refused to continue past a snow-covered shape beside the trail. Jacob dismounted, expecting a dead calf. The shape moved. Ma'am? Eleanor remembered opening her eyes and seeing ice clinging to a stranger's beard. Rebecca, she whispered. Who's Rebecca? My daughter. Then darkness took her. Jacob carried her across his saddle and fought nearly an hour toward the isolated line cabin he used during winter cattle checks. Now Eleanor stood inside it, wearing his dry shirt beneath her dress, while her stockings steamed beside the stove. Jacob checked the thermometer again. Outside, the temperature had fallen 12 degrees in less than an hour. Inside was warmer, but not enough. Eleanor looked toward the narrow bed, then toward Jacob. Mr. Mercer, if you touch me improperly, freezing will become the least of your difficulties. For the first time that night, Jacob almost smiled. Mrs. Hayes, that's the most reassuring thing I've heard since finding you unconscious. Then something heavy struck the cabin wall. Both turned. A second impact followed. Jacob's smile vanished. He reached for his rifle. That's not the wind. The second impact came from the north wall, followed by a scraping sound that made Eleanor step away from the window. Jacob lifted the rifle and motioned for her to remain beside the stove. Copper whinnied outside from the lean-to, then kicked hard against the boards. Something's frightening your horse, Eleanor whispered. Jacob opened the inner shutter only a finger's width. Snow blasted through the crack, but between gusts, he saw a dark shape pressed against the cabin. He lowered the rifle. Cow. A cow? Half frozen by the sound of it. He tied a rope around his waist, fastened the other end to an iron hook beside the door, and pulled on his coat. Eleanor caught his sleeve. You're going outside for cattle? If she stays against that wall, she may break through it. And if she wanders off, she dies. You could die. Jacob looked at her hand on his sleeve. That too. He stepped into the white darkness and disappeared before Eleanor could answer. Through the shutter, she watched the rope jerk and vanish beneath blowing snow. Minutes stretched painfully. Then Jacob reappeared, leading a frost-covered cow toward the lean-to. He returned with ice across his eyebrows and blood on one knuckle where the rope had burned through his glove. Eleanor immediately took his hand. Sit. I'm fine. That was not a request. She cleaned the cut with warm water and wrapped it using a strip torn from her petticoat. Jacob watched her work. You've done this before. 23 years of marriage provides opportunities to repair stubborn men. Your husband, Eleanor's hands slowed. Charles believed ladders were safer when nobody held them. Jacob almost smiled again, but something in her expression stopped him. How long? 8 months. Silence settled between them. I'm sorry, he said. Eleanor tied the bandage. People say that as though sorrow becomes lighter when acknowledged. Does it? No. But kindness makes carrying it less lonely. Jacob looked toward the stove. Eleanor realized she had accidentally spoken to something inside him. And you? She asked. What about me? Nobody builds this much silence without losing someone. His jaw tightened. You ask direct questions. Age removes patience for decorative ones. Jacob added fuel to the stove. My wife died 11 years ago. Eleanor waited. Influenza, he continued. A boy went 3 days later. The cabin suddenly felt smaller. How old? 5. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Jacob, don't. The word came sharper than he intended. He softened it. Please. She nodded. Outside, the storm hammered the roof. Neither spoke for several minutes. Eventually, Jacob checked the thermometer. 39 degrees inside and falling. We need to sleep. Eleanor glanced toward the bed. You truly meant what you said. Every word. Jacob placed his revolver on the floor where she could reach it. You sleep against the wall. I stay outside the blanket edge. If that makes you easier. Eleanor studied him. Then the weapon. And if I snore? I survived cattle drives. She laughed before she could stop herself. It was the first genuine laugh she had made since Charles died, and the sound startled her more than Jacob's invitation had. They lay fully clothed beneath the same quilts, inches separating them while the stove dimmed. Then Copper screamed outside. Jacob sat upright as 3 faint knocks reached the door through the storm. A human voice followed. Help! Eleanor threw off the quilt while Jacob reached for his coat. Stay here. She was already pulling on her boots. You found me because you went into that storm. That does not mean you go back into it. Eleanor tied the scarf beneath her chin. It means someone else is waiting for the same mercy. The cry came again, weaker now. Jacob handed her a second rope. Stay tied to me. Eleanor met his eyes. I intend to. Together they opened the door and stepped into the blizzard. The storm swallowed Jacob and Eleanor before the cabin door had fully closed behind them. The rope between their waists became their only certainty. Jacob followed the cabin wall toward the lean-to. Call again, he shouted. Eleanor cupped both hands around her mouth. We hear you! Keep answering! For several seconds there was nothing except wind. Then a faint cry came from somewhere east. Jacob changed direction, driving a second rope around a fence post before moving farther into the darkness. Nearby, they found a young man collapsed beside an overturned hand sled. He was Eli Turner, a 19-year-old ranch hand. One boot was missing, and his arms were wrapped around a small wooden box as though it mattered more than his life. Jacob dragged him upright while Eleanor secured the rope around his chest. Can you walk? Maybe. Then maybe is enough. They fought back toward the cabin, Eleanor pushing Eli whenever his knees failed, while Jacob pulled from ahead. Inside, Eleanor stripped the frozen stocking from Eli's foot and wrapped it in dry wool. Jacob examined the box. What were you carrying? Eli's teeth chattered. Medicine. For Rebecca Hayes. Eleanor froze. Rebecca? Eli looked at her. You know her? She's my daughter. Eli paled. Rebecca had developed a dangerous fever 2 days earlier. Her injured husband could barely walk. The storm had trapped them at their ranch. The town doctor had prepared medicine, but nobody had reached them. Eli volunteered because Rebecca once nursed his sister through fever. How far? Eleanor demanded. 3 miles southeast. She stood immediately. Jacob blocked the door. No. My daughter is sick. And walking into that storm tonight kills you before you reach the first mile. Then we ride. Copper can barely stand in this wind. Eleanor's voice hardened. You expect me to sleep while my daughter lies 3 miles away, needing what is sitting on your table? Jacob met her anger without moving. I expect you to survive long enough to help her. She stared at him, breathing hard. At first light, he continued, if visibility improves, we go together. Eleanor looked toward the box. Every instinct said leave. Everything she had learned said Jacob was right. She sat beside Eli instead. Then we keep him alive until morning. The cabin held 3, and the temperature continued falling. Jacob fed the stove sparingly. Eleanor warmed broth, and kept Eli awake until feeling returned painfully to his foot. Near 3 in the morning, the young man finally slept beside the stove. Jacob looked at the thermometer, 35 degrees. Bed, he said. Eleanor did not argue this time. They lay beneath the quilts fully clothed, closer than before because the cold had stripped embarrassment of importance. Neither spoke. You knew I would go after Rebecca, Eleanor whispered. Yes? Why stop me? Because grief makes people mistake urgency for direction. She turned toward him. You learned that after your son? Jacob stared at the ceiling. After my wife died, I rode through a snowstorm trying to reach a doctor who had already left town. Nearly froze beside the road. Spent 11 years wondering why I survived when they didn't. Eleanor's voice softened. Perhaps surviving wasn't the punishment you thought it was. Jacob looked at her. Their faces were close. Eleanor saw not a lonely cowboy, but a man surviving without deciding to live.
There is something worth noticing here. The blizzard may have forced Jacob and Eleanor beneath the same roof, but the cold was no longer the greatest distance between them. Both had already survived the person they expected to grow old beside. Eleanor responded by searching for somewhere she could still be useful. Jacob responded by disappearing into 11 years of solitude, and perhaps that is why this moment matters. Neither of them needed someone to erase the past. They needed someone who understood that surviving loss and returning to life are not the same thing. Jacob had rescued Eleanor from the snow, but without realizing it, she had begun pulling him out of a much older storm. If you enjoy Western stories about second chances, courage, and ordinary people finding hope when they least expect it, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because the hardest part of their night is still ahead.
Then Eli cried out beside the stove. Jacob rose instantly. The ranch hand was pointing toward the window. Beyond the frosted glass, a distant orange glow pulsed through the storm. Jacob's face drained of color. That's southeast. Eleanor was already standing. The glow brightened. Somewhere in the direction of Rebecca's ranch, something was burning. The wind struck the roof again, making the rafters groan above them. Eleanor tightened her coat around her shoulders. Whatever waited beyond that door frightened her, but remaining safely inside while Rebecca faced danger frightened her far more. Eleanor reached the door before Jacob caught her arm. If that fire is Rebecca's ranch, standing here changes nothing. Jacob looked toward the orange glow pulsing beyond the frosted window. And rushing blindly toward it could leave your daughter waiting for someone who never arrives. Eleanor's eyes filled, but her voice remained steady. Then tell me how we reach her. Jacob studied the wind, opened Amos Mercer's old compass, and turned toward Eli. Fence line? Eli pushed himself upright. Runs southeast from your lower pasture. Passes within 200 yards of Hayes land. Jacob nodded. That's our road. He packed blankets, matches, the medicine, and a small hatchet into a canvas bag. Eleanor tied a wool scarf across her face. You're staying here, Jacob told Eli. Keep the stove alive. The ranch hand started protesting. That foot won't survive another mile. Jacob secured one rope around his waist and handed the second loop to Eleanor. Whatever happens, you do not untie yourself. She fastened it. Whatever happens, neither do you. They stepped outside. The wind had weakened slightly, but snow still erased the world beyond several yards. Jacob found the fence by crawling until his gloves struck wire. They followed it southeast, sometimes walking, sometimes sinking to their knees. Eleanor fell twice. Each time Jacob pulled her upright without speaking. The orange glow disappeared, then returned brighter. Smoke finally reached them. Eleanor began moving faster. Rebecca! Jacob caught her shoulder. Stay on the fence! They reached a gate buried almost completely beneath snow. Beyond it, flames climbed from a collapsed structure. Eleanor's breath stopped. The house. No, Jacob said. Barn. They pushed forward and found the farmhouse standing 50 yards beyond the burning barn. Its western windows were dark. Jacob hammered on the door. A man opened it holding a revolver, then nearly dropped the weapon. Mrs. Hayes? Thomas Hayes, Rebecca's 33-year-old husband, had one leg wrapped in splints. Eleanor pushed past him. Where is she? Rebecca lay beneath quilts beside a failing stove, her face flushed with fever. Eleanor dropped beside her. Mama? Rebecca whispered. Eleanor pressed both hands around her daughter's face. I'm here. Jacob gave Thomas the medicine. What happened outside? Roof lantern fell when the barn started shifting. Hay caught. Thomas looked toward the stove. Wood piles inside the barn. Jacob's expression changed. The burning building contained their fuel. Without it, the farmhouse would become dangerously cold before daylight. Eleanor understood immediately. Can we take them to your cabin? Not Rebecca through this wind. Jacob examined the room. Then we bring heat here. Thomas pointed toward a small cottonwood stack near the creek, perhaps 80 yards from the house. Jacob took the rope. Eleanor blocked him. You've already crossed 3 miles, and she needs fire. So do you. Their eyes held. Something unspoken passed between them. Eleanor took the second rope. Together, they made repeated trips to the cottonwood stack, dragging wood on an overturned feeding trough. By the 4th journey, Jacob's steps had slowed badly. Enough, Eleanor said. One more. Jacob. He turned, and she saw his face had gone strangely pale. Then his knees folded. Eleanor caught the rope before the wind dragged him sideways. Jacob! He tried rising, but collapsed again. She remembered his words from the cabin. Grief makes people mistake urgency for direction. Eleanor stopped pulling toward the woodpile. Instead, she tied the rope beneath Jacob's arms and dragged him toward the farmhouse inch by inch. Thomas crawled from the doorway and helped pull him inside. Eleanor stripped Jacob's frozen coat away and wrapped him beside Rebecca. For the next 2 hours, she tended both of them while the storm weakened outside. Near dawn, Rebecca's fever finally began falling. Minutes later, Jacob opened his eyes. Eleanor was holding his hand. Did we get enough wood? He whispered. She laughed through tears. You impossible man. Jacob squeezed her fingers weakly. Then Rebecca opened her eyes and watched her mother holding the lonely cowboy's hand beside the fire. Mama, she whispered, almost smiling. Who exactly did you bring with you? Rebecca's question brought the first real laughter Eleanor had heard since the storm began. Even Jacob managed a tired smile from beneath the blankets. Someone with poor judgment about weather, Eleanor answered. Jacob looked at her. That describes both of us. By sunrise, the blizzard had weakened to scattered snow, but the temperature remained dangerously low. Thomas kept the stove burning with the cottonwood they had dragged inside, while Eleanor gave Rebecca another dose of medicine. Her fever continued falling. Jacob recovered more slowly. Feeling returned painfully to his fingers, and Eleanor refused to let him stand until he could hold a cup without shaking. You are remarkably commanding for a guest, he said. I stopped being your guest when I dragged you through the snow. Fair enough. By mid-morning, the sky brightened. Jacob finally stepped outside with Eleanor. The burned barn had collapsed into a smoking black ruin. Snowdrifts covered the fences, and the prairie stretched white and silent toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond it stood Jacob's lonely cabin. Eli, Eleanor said. Jacob nodded. We go back. Rebecca protested when her mother prepared to leave, but Eleanor kissed her forehead. The medicine is here, your fever is breaking, and Thomas has enough wood. That boy is alone because he helped save you. Thomas handed Jacob an old pair of snowshoes. The return journey took nearly 3 hours. When the line cabin finally appeared through the whiteness, Eleanor felt an unexpected relief that had nothing to do with shelter. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Eli opened the door before they reached it. Thought you were dead. Jacob stepped inside. Disappointed? Mostly hungry. Eleanor laughed. They remained another night, because the roads were impassable. This time, when darkness came, and Jacob looked awkwardly toward the single bed, Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Are you going to make another scandalous proposal? I was considering the floor. After nearly freezing once today, she lifted the quilt. Share my bed or freeze, Mr. Mercer. Jacob stared at her before laughing, a deep, unfamiliar sound that seemed to surprise him. They lay beside each other again, but the silence between them had changed. Charles was a good man, Eleanor said eventually. I loved him. Jacob nodded. You should have. Loving someone who is gone does not require dying beside their memory. Jacob turned toward her. Eleanor continued, Your wife and boy mattered. They always will. But 11 years is a long time to punish yourself for surviving. His eyes glistened in the lantern light. I don't know how to begin again. Eleanor reached across the narrow space and took his hand. Neither do I. Morning arrived clear and brilliantly cold. Riders from Willow Creek appeared before noon searching for survivors. Rebecca recovered completely over the following weeks. Eli kept every toe despite severe frostbite. And the story of Jacob Mercer sheltering Eleanor Hayes traveled through town faster than either wanted. Spring eventually softened Cedar Draw. Eleanor delayed returning east, first because Rebecca needed help, then because Thomas's leg required another month, and finally because she discovered she no longer wanted to leave. Jacob began finding reasons to visit the Hayes Ranch. A broken gate required inspection. A missing calf somehow required coffee. Rebecca noticed everything and said nothing. In May, Eleanor rode with Jacob to the Line cabin. Prairie flowers had replaced the snowdrifts. Inside, the little bed remained beside the stove. Eleanor touched its wooden frame. This caused considerable trouble. Jacob stood behind her, saved considerable trouble too. She turned. Do you still intend to live alone forever? Jacob considered the question. Not if someone stubborn enough can be persuaded otherwise. Eleanor smiled. Then ask properly. He did. They married that summer beneath a cottonwood tree near Rebecca's ranch. Years later, whenever grandchildren asked how they met, Jacob always claimed he rescued Eleanor from a blizzard. Eleanor always corrected him. He found me first, she would say. But before morning came, we had both rescued someone. And sometimes, love arrived exactly that way. Not as youth imagined it, but quietly, after loss, when two people who believed their best years were behind them discovered there was still warmth enough to share.
Maybe that is what makes Jacob and Eleanor's story worth remembering. The storm did not give either of them a new life. It simply placed two people who thought an important part of theirs was already over in the same small cabin and forced them to discover otherwise. Eleanor never stopped loving Charles. Jacob never stopped loving the wife and little boy he lost. Their second chance did not require forgetting them. It required understanding that the heart can carry what has been lost without closing itself to what may still be found. And when the blizzard finally passed, the greatest thing they carried out of that cabin wasn't simply survival. It was permission to live again. So perhaps Eleanor was right all those years later. Jacob found her first, but before morning came, they had both rescued someone. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments. Do you believe love can find someone twice in one lifetime? And if you enjoy emotional Wild West stories about courage, loss, survival, and second chances, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are many more stories waiting beyond the next horizon. Until the next one, remember, sometimes the warmth that saves us isn't the fire we build. It's the person who chooses to stay beside us when the cold arrives.